Josh, my man, how are you doing?
What's going on, man? I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. It seems a little bit cold, whenever you are. It seems at least. Maybe it's the lighting.
It's cold for where I live. I live in Florida, and it's 74 Celsius, which is, or sorry, 74 Fahrenheit, which is pretty cold for us.
Yeah, Florida, man. There's a running meme about Florida, which goes like something like Florida man and something crazy happens. I don't know if
Yeah,
you're aware of it.
yeah.
It's pretty funny, man.
If you Google your birthday and Florida man, you'll
Yeah,
find
that's the one.
you'll find some interesting articles about wild things people have done in Florida, which I don't know where it happens because I just stay inside.
But is that legit though? Is Florida?
Yeah, I think it's legit. Like they're real news articles.
It's really funny, man. I love those sort of memes. My man Zach, welcome, welcome. It's such a privilege to have you both here today.
What's up, man? How's it going?
It's been a while. It's been a long time. I think it was, let's say, a year ago, 2 years ago, man, that we checked.
Something like that. Been yeah, it's been a minute. Would have been the last time we would have talked. Would have been the proximity to failure project. So that would have been yeah. It seems like forever ago at this point.
So once again, we're reunited to talk about volume, to talk about gains, mad gains, which I know we're all keen on.
It's all that matters.
Oh, for real, man. So first and foremost, I don't want to abuse of your time. First, I want to thank you both for having the disposition to talk about your work, to because I know you've talked in great length about this particular study, which I'm proud to say I'm one of those people that already watched both the lengthy episodes and also the episode you had with Dr. Eric Holmes on the Data Driven Strength channel. And man, it's been super informative, super interesting. I've learned a lot. I've also kind of questioned myself on a lot of things, and it's so cool, man, to get to talk to you about this. So thanks for that, for real.
Yeah, thanks for having us, man. I think I'll start by apologizing because you're not going to get that time back. And that was a lot of time of podcasts that you listened to. But yeah, man, that's the goal, right? Is to try to be as transparent as possible and have those resources for folks, people doing science communication like yourself. Um, I guess we wanted to provide tools for those sorts of folks, and we've definitely seen that happen, um, which makes us happy. Um, so yeah, appreciate you investing the time into that, man.
100%.
It's such a challenge because science communication, well, in social media, and that's further ahead. Something I wanted to talk to you about because we have people like Eric Holmes per se that he does both things really well, the science bit and the science communication bit, but maybe other folks tend to get lost in the social media side of things. And with this particular data set that you presented, it's really easy to go to certain band that, let's say big volume, it's sponsoring all of this and you're getting your paychecks and you're not actually in Florida, you're perhaps in Europe having the vacation of your lifetime. Who knows, man? There's no way to tell. It's really challenging. And also those 4 hour length podcasts, I think they're a necessity because some things as a reader of your work goes right through your head. Like, why did these guys choose to do a meta-regression? Why they run all these different models? So that's the first thing I wanted to ask you. What were your thoughts, or let's say your mentality to tackle this very intimidating project? Let me reframe that. What did you wanted to do different to the
Yeah.
other meta-analysis that we already had to that moment?
Well, you alluded to having Zach on alive a while back to talk about his meta-regressions on proximity to failure, and Zach won't say this himself, so I'll say it for him. I think that has presented a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how to look at some fundamental questions in our field. I think in the past, it's common to look at training variables in maybe a more rudimentary way, or maybe a more categorical or a binary way. So training to failure versus not to training. To failure versus not to failure. Low volume, low reps, high reps. But in reality, we have a lot more options than just that, right? We don't really think in terms of program design. We don't think in a binary sense or in a categorical sense. So that's one reason. And another reason is that that helps us understand the nature of the relationship in a more granular sense, right? Because if you just kind of categorize different training studies as, again, to failure versus not to failure, you kind of lose some power in terms of detecting something that might be there. So in the case of Zach's RAR meta-regressions, that revealed, if you will, among many other reasons, I think it revealed a relationship that might have other analyses might not have been able to detect for some of those reasons. The same idea with the case of volume. Okay, you can on the front end say, hey, we're going to look at less than 10 sets versus more than 10 sets, or we're going to look at all the studies that compare. We're just going to categorize all the low volume groups and all the high volume groups and see which way they generally lead in the context of these studies. And those are great analyses, and those are a lot of those are somewhere in our manuscript or our supplementary materials because they do have inherent value. But we always come to it from a pretty practical perspective in the sense of I just want to understand what is the nature of this relationship and what is our best estimation of that with the current research that we have using the most powerful tools, if you will, from a statistical sense. Because that really changes how you think about the variables and therefore apply them for yourself or for a client. If there's a very clear plateau in volume, that's a lot different of a framework compared to if it's a completely linear relationship amongst all the volumes we have, or if it's a linear relationship versus one that has diminishing returns, like we saw in our analysis, that's also different. So there's a lot of reasons, but this sort of approach that we took of a continuous dose response relationship, we like to think is much more practical and also more powerful from a statistical perspective.
Yeah, and I also think it's worth mentioning, let's say the prior meta-analysis by Bass and Echo Bass Valle. We find 10 to 20 sets, something, something. But if I recall correctly, it was only 6 studies and only evaluated the quads, the triceps, and the biceps, if I recall correctly. So that's only 6 studies. But in your meta-analysis, you had a big ass amount of studies. What were your inclusion criteria and why did or how did you found the methods to include much more studies than this prior meta-analysis that can perhaps change the results?
Zach, I'll let you take this one.
Trying to remember including criteria. We'll agree on that. So ultimately, I think when we sought out to answer the question, it was kind of a combo project, and the second half of the project is going to be coming out soon by Jake Remmert, who's also a member of our lab, who's done an awesome project on per session volume. So per session volume is basically a function of the weekly volume that Josh might analyze with training frequency. So when we sought out to kind of talk about this project in the first place, we kind of need both studies in the first place to properly analyze the per session volume relationship. So when it came to Josh's project, that was mostly focused on the weekly time frame of those variables. We weren't just going to leave those studies out because you can through appropriate statistical methods kind of handle those difference in the independent variable that those studies are manipulating to gain additional clarity from the set volumes that those studies are training at. So that was essentially what we decided to do, is any study that manipulated um, training volume or frequency, and there was like one or two studies that did both technically. After filtering some additional criteria, just as a basic example, it needed to be either load and or proximity to failure controlled. So we wouldn't want multiple fluctuating variables in a given study. Those can also be handled if we have like a massive data set. But in this kind of question, we wanted to keep things relatively tight because we knew we were going to be dealing with quite a few studies already. And I'm sure Josh and Jake can tell you how arduous the data extraction process is. But ultimately, we wanted to keep that net wide because, like Josh said, we view the primary value of these projects is giving us as much clarity on these kind of fundamental principles as we possibly can. So, when at all possible, including more studies and handling them as well as we can statistically to gain as much statistical power as we possibly can to pick up on these small effects if they're there, and also just give us additional clarity on how the relationship works. One thing I was like just thinking of is like a very basic example of like how this stuff can change. I'm a big note card guy. I don't know if it's going to come through on the live, but basically, if we have this relationship where we have a linear relationship here and these two dots, that would be a comparison between like a normal categorical meta-analysis. And so you would basically be comparing dot one, the low volumes, to dot two of the high volumes. But this additional piece of clarity of the plateauing relationship versus a linear relationship, you want to be able to detect that, or you wouldn't ever know. It would just show up as a difference in a smaller magnitude between those two dots. And so ultimately, including as many studies as possible in our inclusion criteria allows us to really pick up on those minute things that give us a little bit of a direction, that have obviously practical implications. Of course, as the 5 Hour podcast clearly states, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and by no means is it a perfect project with, the final say for all this stuff. But that's kind of the why we decided to go the way we wanted to go.
Yeah, man, that's super interesting and also kind of segues to two things I wanted to touch with you. The first one is who came up with the fractional set method because I think it's super clarifying for us to make sense of all of this information. And also, can we talk a little bit more about what is actually and how those multi-level meta regression actually works? Because I think that actually helps us to know what happens between point A and point two instead of categorizing more volume, less volume. Well, what's all that
Yeah,
blank space, right?
yeah. I'll tackle the fractional quantification method, and then Zach, I'll let you give the elevator pitch on the, what exactly a multi-level meta-regression is, because that's an important point. Because you don't just take all the, percentage increases in muscle size and, you know, not really can account for the fact that it's different labs and different studies. So I'll let Zach tackle that a little bit. But regarding the volume quantification method, I don't think I can take credit for it. Maybe Zach or Jake can in terms of coming up with that. But that is just a common notion that people have landed on in practice because it's quite intuitive, right? Um, if you're doing bench press, I think most people would say, "Hey, this is primarily for chest hypertrophy. That's going to be kind of the muscle that limits you at the end of a set. It's going to get a good amount of stimulus. But obviously, there's more than just the chest contributing to that exercise. Um, so as a result, people in practice might have counted that as a third of a set for triceps, or two-thirds of a set for triceps, or maybe half a set for triceps. And previous meta-analyses have never used kind of that fractional approach where you say, hey, this muscle is involved. We're measuring this muscle in terms of trying to understand how much hypertrophy it experiences as a result of this training program. Um, but it's, again, probably not like the best possible exercise for that measured muscle. But again, previous meta-analyses have not really taken that approach, and that makes sense why they haven't, because generally in science you have to be pretty precise and clear and have kind of clean lines in terms of your definitions. So in the past, meta-analyses might have just counted sets of bench press as one set for triceps, right? And also one set for chest, which doesn't really pass the sniff test to, even researchers, right? And I think that's especially the case for coaches and well-experienced trainees. So we said, okay, let's do what people have done in the past and count all contributing muscles as one set. So like they've done in previous meta-analyses, but let's also explore some other approaches. So if we use our bench press example, what if we just completely ignored any triceps stimulus that might have occurred there? Or what if we counted it as half of a set? And that was kind of step one in the analyses in a lot of ways, because we wanted to determine which volume quantification method, again, that previous method, the fractional method, or just direct sets, which one was most likely to explain the underlying data with high accuracy, right? So that was, I think, figure two or figure three. I think figure three in the paper. There are, you can think of them as like scores for which analysis, or sorry, which quantification method was the quote unquote best. And we did find evidence that this fractional approach of half a set for indirect exercises was the best. So in our view, we're like, okay, this is not the most objective thing in the world, but we were clear in our methods and we provided evidence that it is better than previous approaches. Um, and I think that has been quite well received, to be honest, because it's something that people have suspected in the past is a limitation of previous meta-analyses. So I'm hopeful that in whatever the next meta-analysis is, whether it's in 2025 or 2030, whatever, I hope they use that method or maybe even a better one. But I do think that fractional approach, and again, we found evidence that it's quite a bit better than the alternatives and what's been used in the past. So I do think that's a strength of our project.
Yeah. I guess from the elevator pitch of kind of the reason we did things the way that we did, or actually how it works, is I think when people see the plots, it can get confusing because you may think, hey, all they're doing is, opening up Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel, putting in all these effect sizes within a given training group. So let's say we pick out study number one, we look at training group number one, who is, performing 5 sets per week, and they got an average increase of 10% in their muscle size. We basically plot all of those for all the different training groups, and then we ultimately fit a line through those and kind of see what the story tells. An astute reader or somebody who's kind of thinking about this at a deeper level will obviously think about that and be like, well, that's maybe a little bit limited because there are differences between studies that could obviously impact the amount of muscle growth that you would observe at a given set volume. So this is a basic example. Certain labs have, a higher quality training environment. Certain exercises are obviously going to be more effective, as we know from a lot of the recent research. Maybe they trained at a different proximity to failure. Maybe the nutrition was better controlled. All of these different factors that differ between studies. And so often what I'll call kind of a standard approach to meta-regression is essentially a follow-up procedure to a more traditional meta-analysis that you'll see to try to get some indication of where some of this unexplained variability in the effect sizes. So you just think one of those forest plots where a lot of the different effect sizes are kind of bouncing all over the place and it's not super duper consistent. Typically, what a meta-regression is going to do is kind of a follow-up procedure to that more standard forest plot to see, is there any factors we can utilize to better explain some of this variability to give us a more comprehensive understanding of the topic. And so, what those often don't do is account for the fact that effect sizes are coming from different groups, and those groups are nested within studies. And so, essentially, the easiest way to think about this, and one of the other analyses that we did in the paper was trying to make this as explicit of an understanding as humanly possible, just to show other people kind of how it works. Is essentially what you're doing is for every single study, you're going to fit a model to that study individually, more or less. And then you're going to get the relationship after controlling for all of those study level characteristics. Then we're going to pool those and ultimately fit a best fit relationship that takes into account all of those between, within, and ultimately remaining levels of variation across the entire data set. And with all that understanding and some, statistical techniques that are a little bit harder to describe, we're able to kind of differentiate between which of these types of dose response patterns is the highest probability of explaining the overall relationship that we're trying to approximate in kind of this theoretical cloud of the target population that we're aiming to generalize the research to. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a general understanding of kind of how it works. If you have any further questions, let me know.
Yeah, totally. I think the key aspect of or mindset to keep with this particular meta-analysis is how you came to the conclusions, how you came to the results, not the results on itself that more volume better, because maybe that's already we already training with high volumes, but what are the limitations of the prior studies? And also, you already alluded to it, Zach, but the models, I'm sure you're familiar with the saying that goes something like all models are wrong, but
Well,
some are
some are
useful.
useful.
Some
Yeah.
Yep.
that one. And I wanted to ask you about the several different models that you employed, and which one did you find it was the best fitted for this particular set of data? Because I know
Uh,
for the people, I'm sorry to interrupt, for the people tuning in, I know it's super geeky, but this is where the interesting part of this particular work is. At least
Mhm.
that's how I view it.
no, this is important, man, and I think it's a great question because it's an important thing to emphasize because you can look at the plot and say, oh, blue line looks like it goes up, more
Yeah.
volume is better, and like to some degree that is true because that is our model. But understanding model and understanding, um, yeah, some of the limitations is absolutely key to not kind of get ahead of ourselves, if you will. Zach mentioned some of the things that we did to give ourselves, in our estimation, the most robust analysis we could possibly do with the data that's available. But this is still exercise science. We're still, um, you know, using methods that I think we all still have some questions about, for example. That's not to say that we should throw them out by any means, or to say that we should maybe like just use some other measurement like isometric strength instead of hypertrophy or something like that. But instead it's just important to understand that like this is by no means, and I think Zach used this terminology before, our best fit model for hypertrophy is by no means the final word on volume for hypertrophy. It is using our methods, which again we think are solid, but a reasonable person could say, I don't think you did this right, or you should have done this the other way. Again, reasonable person could come to that, and that could influence the best fit model. And that leads me to an undervalued point about our project from my estimation, kind of watching from the sidelines, people discuss our project, is just failing to really recognize and emphasize model uncertainty. So, for example, I'll use the strength data. If you look at the volume dose response, or I should say the effects of additional sets per week on additional strength gains, you see a very strong slope for the first about 5 sets or so. And then you see pretty strong diminishing returns from about 5 to 10 sets. So basically, what that means is the additional strength gain you seem to get from additional sets in that 5 to 10 range just gets smaller and smaller. And then around 8 to 10 sets or so, it more or less plateaus. Okay. So if you look at that and you say you do not get additional strength gains past 5 to 10 sets per week, that is, I think, just way too strong of a claim, to be honest, because of model uncertainty. So basically, the way it works on the back end, if you will, is we give the computer options for different models that it could fit the data to. So it kind of forces the data into the model. So one of them is a linear fit, right? And everyone is probably familiar with that. It's a straight line, y equals mx plus b, and the computer kind of makes it work, if you will. And then there are, I think, 7 other ones that we looked at. And again, those are all listed in the manuscript, that are generally quite a bit more complex. And the computer kind of comes to a mathematical solution within the constraints of the model. And then after that, it looks at the 7 or 8 model types that we told it to look at, and the computer basically gives a score that's a combination of what best describes the underlying data, but also balancing that with simplicity. Because if you were to best fit the underlying data, you would get this really squiggly line that literally fits every single point, which obviously is not something that exists in physiology. That's just noise in the data set. So it's kind of this balancing act of, okay, we do want to be able to notice if there's an inflection that starts a plateau, or an inflection that starts a plateau and then an inverted U. But we also want to ensure that we're not like getting super granular and assuming that every single data point is a perfect representation of the dose response relationship. So the reason I am emphasizing this is because if you were to change something about the analysis, and the easiest way to change something about the analysis is to get 5 more high quality volume studies in there, right? Next thing you know, there could be another best fit model type, for example, for strength, right? And is it it's highly unlikely that for strength it would become a linear dose response relationship as opposed to like this strong plateau pretty early on that we saw. But you could very easily end up with a dose response relationship that has diminishing returns, so the effect is smaller and smaller as you go, but it kind of indefinitely slowly goes up, right? And then maybe you could call the plateau closer to 18 sets or 20 sets, right? And I think that's important because um, again, people are just under recognizing that in my view, and that's important to keep in mind because I think people are trying to kind of connect the dots between the four main models in our analysis. So the dose response of volume on hypertrophy, volume and strength, frequency and hypertrophy, frequency and strength, those are all in the paper. And I think if you try to like make it all fit within your your model for how training works, and you just assume that these are like the the relationships that are definitely the case, you're going to run into some issues, right? But I think just again recognizing model uncertainty. Hey, if we got five more volume studies, maybe the hypertrophy is more of a plateau around 20 to 25 sets. That's totally possible. Maybe strength keeps going if we get more and better quality data. But this is the best guess that we have right now based on some of those metrics that the statistical software uses.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think one really important aspect to add on this data analysis is the I think it's called moderator analysis. Let's say age, sex, probably nutritional intake. Maybe some of these things aren't quite well reported in the studies included, or maybe we just don't know. How did you actually perform analysis for these moderators in particular?
That could be a whole thing in itself, but that was something we kind of went in with a different perspective to this whole project, and kind of through doing it and through learning more. And this is something I would definitely approach differently in the proximity to failure project in hindsight, just kind of how we went about it. But ultimately, the problem with moderator analyses in our field is that you're essentially looking at a comparison across studies that doesn't occur within studies. And so the issue that we just talked about in terms of being able to look at the relationship for volume within every single study and then aggregating those, that really can occur for nearly, there was like a couple moderators that had actual between study or within study comparisons. So to give a concrete example, let's say we wanted to look at the differences between upper and lower body volume curves, right? In order to do that really effectively, we would basically need studies that looked at high, medium, and low volumes in a study, but both within the upper and lower body within that same project. So they would need to measure the pecs and the quads. And then you would need multiple of those studies to really effectively aggregate those. Without those types of comparisons, essentially what you're relying on is what I would consider very, very preliminary evidence, because you're essentially only relying on the between study comparisons. So I have 10 studies that only measured upper body, and I have 10 studies that only measured lower body, and then I'm comparing the effects observed between those two things. But like we just mentioned, there's probably 20 other characteristics that are also differing between those studies. And a very, very important one that we mentioned in the insanely long podcast that no one listened to. The rest period one has been one that's been really, really popular that people have talked about a lot. And I still think it's totally reasonable and conceivable to have some effect of that variable on the dose response relationship. We didn't find conclusive evidence of that. But just a very basic limitation you can think about is if I'm planning a high volume study, I'm almost certain going to bump my rest periods down to basically the lowest I could feasibly manage, because I'm trying to manage the training time of my research staff. And so you have a few of those little things that are kind of hidden in the research that make these between study comparisons so challenging. And so the moderator analyses, while they obviously are quite literally our best guess, I have substantially less confidence in those, even more so than our main models, which we're already trying to put caution tape up with. Those I'm like, hey, this is grounds for a future project or a future study to investigate really, really well. And here might be a leading hypothesis. But in no way, shape, or form am I using those to make really, really firm predictions about what is going to happen in any applied scenario for a lifter in the real world, just because, again, there's just so many limitations of those when aggregating things across studies when you really don't have any direct evidence on that question to begin with. So, yeah, it's a big part of the project, and it was really important. It was something we went in with, really high hopes for. But the more that we really thought about it, and just some limitations of the data set that we ultimately collected at the end of things, it wasn't nearly as fruitful in terms of what we actually had access to than we would have thought. Not as many studies measured upper and lower body hypertrophy, or not as many studies looked at both sexes as an example, things like that. So yeah, I could go on that for hours, but that's probably sufficient for now.
And I think it's so challenging to do the work that you guys just did because these things we can read the paper, we can listen perhaps to half the podcast of 4 hours because well, I don't know, but I did see the whole thing. It's easy to pinpoint, right? Oh, but they didn't look at this, or they didn't take this into account. Well, maybe they did, but the data wasn't available in the prior study. So what you gonna do? Well, you're not gonna come up with data from out of nowhere. And I also think, in regards to those other moderators that are perhaps impossible to find out with this set of data, it's perhaps the prior training volume that the subjects were doing. It's also perhaps that frequency it's established as a weekly variable, but that's just arbitrary to a certain degree because weeks can be different for different people in regards to how they program their training, right? So that leaves us with much more questions and not just, oh yeah, more volume, more gains, which I think most people tend to jump on that conclusion with your setup, with your results. And that's why I wanted to ask you both, what were your initial thoughts when you got the results? Where you were like, oh man, here we go again, like the meme from Grand Theft Auto, like, oh shit, here we go again? Or how were did it change your perhaps perception of things?
So, did it change my perception of things? I would say short answer is yes. Um, I guess just to like go back in time a little bit from when we started this project. It was multiple years ago at this point. Took a little bit longer than we anticipated. Um, but when we started the project, I think I would have hypothesized something resembling an inverted U. So just to make sure the listener understands, you get obviously some sort of dose response relationship with additional volume, but then it plateaus, your hypertrophy plateaus, and there might even be a point where the hypertrophy you get is less as a result of under recovery or over fatigue or lower training quality as a result of those higher volumes. Um, as I as we systematically went through the studies and extracted them and kind of reread everything, I was like, man, I'm having a hard time finding a study, or I would kind of reflect and be like, I'm having a hard time thinking of a study that I extracted that saw a really significant leaning in favor of lower volumes. Of course, there are plenty of studies that don't find a statistically significant difference between lower and higher volumes. But that's kind of the reason you do a meta-regression or a meta-analysis in the first place, is to kind of wash out some of that noise. Um, but I was like, man, there's some studies that do lean quite a bit in favor of lower volumes, but it's just not all that much. So by the time we got the results, I wasn't all that surprised that there wasn't this sort of inverted U sort of relationship. I was a bit surprised that the diminishing returns weren't stronger. So in other words, that the kind of hypertrophy that you get near the very end of the curve, so let's say in the 20 plus set range, I honestly expected that to be a little bit less. Um, but I wasn't all that surprised with our final best fit model by the time we got to that point. And again, like, I look at that model and I say, yes, it goes up, there's diminishing returns. But I also think of all the limitations that went into it. I think quite a bit about those credible intervals. So if you look at the figure, you see the thin, darker blue line, but then you also see um, the lighter blue intervals that go around that, and they're quite wide, especially as you get further and further along the curve. So I look at that and I say, oh, yeah, best fit is that it seems to go up. We don't have a ton of data beyond 25 sets, and it's totally compatible with a plateau around 20 to 25 plus. And I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being a plateau, with additional data. So that's how I view it. I don't think that that's all that like crazy. I understand how it can be crazy if you just kind of see that, especially if it's presented in kind of a pro volume light. So short answer is no, I wasn't surprised by the time we got it. Probably surprised compared to what I expected 2 years earlier. And then in terms of how it's shaped how I think about training, I think it has helped me in the sense that I'm less worried about the inverted U. I think that can kind of almost be like a stressor for some people if that's how they think about volume, right? It's kind of this like, you know, this monster that might come get you if you accidentally do too much volume. You're going to have very poor recovery that you can't detect, and you would be getting twice as much gains if you were to cut your volume in half. That still might occur. You still might get twice the gains if you cut the volume in half, but it's going to be pretty obvious in my opinion. I think if you can get through a training program, you're not running yourself into the ground. You're not disrupting your sleep because of, overreaching type symptoms. Um, you're, but it might require training hard, which is might be a bit of a challenge. I think I'm less scared of overdoing it, and I'm more just cognizant of what is a volume that is realistic for me to sustain, what is a volume that I don't resent training from, and I'm going to kind of stick around there as opposed to kind of finding this optimal volume for myself, or trying to make sure I avoid at all costs, training too much and getting at the other end of that inverted view. That's been the biggest paradigm shift for me, and it's genuinely been a very important one because that really changes the whole framework of just training dosage in general.
I'm sorry, I was waiting for Zach if you wanted to comment something,
Oh,
man. If not, I can
yeah,
go
no.
ahead. Sorry, man.
No, yeah, I mean, very similar for me. I mean, from a practical perspective, I think it's made me more comfortable just moving things in general. I think the understanding four sets can, with a pretty high bar to cross in terms of resulting in meaningful progress. It's not the most trained cohort, but like, from meta analytic standards, like a relatively low volume can keep you moving forward. Josh will know like the exact rationale better than me, but in terms of changes in training volume up or down, I'm not super concerned. That's a major deterrent or accelerant for progress. So to me, ultimately, the project, that conversation with Josh, who knows that area really well for his PhD, and also seeing this curve has just made me more comfortable moving things around in general. I think Josh already kind of mentioned it. I don't really think there's one like optimal volume for every person that you're like painstakingly trying to find with your programming. And if you're outside of that range a little bit on either side, you're going to be missing a ton of gains. Like, I think the principles are going to be relatively consistent between individuals, and it's ultimately just given all of my lifestyle constraints and environmental constraints from a recovery perspective, what can I tolerate right now? And ultimately, what's going to allow me to maximize the volume under the curve in a year, 2 year, 5 years, which is probably a very different answer than I think people look at this curve initially and immediately, take things away. Like Josh and I, we along with the other co-authors, made this project, right, and we're not out here blasting 45 sets or whatever. Quite the opposite. So yeah, I think it's just made me more comfortable with realizing volume can be a moving target that fits with all the other pieces of your lifestyle and recovery constraints, and it's just going to probably change the rate of progress that you're experiencing, but that's ultimately going to be capped by things that are kind of but also kind of not within your control, and you're just trying to do whatever makes sense over the long run, and keeping that consistent.
This is why I quit my job. This is why I just train twice a day, and that's what Zach is saying is, you just need to set everything up in your life around your training and get as much volume in as possible, and the rest will take care of itself, I think.
Yeah, some would call it the Mamba mentality. You gotta hustle.
Hey,
You
hey, I
gotta
just checked my watch. It's time to dial in. Let's go.
to get those 40 sets in. And this is what I find. perhaps somewhat paradoxical. I had a conversation with James Krieger actually a while back about volume and all these things, and most of your responses were like, "Well, we don't know. Perhaps you could try, some stuff like this." And I find that it's interesting, empowering also, and liberating in a mental, let's say, side of things, because it gives you the power to do the training that you're doing and just be patient, pay attention to the performance that you're getting from that training, and then adjust on the fly. You don't need to have the exact, let's say, maximum recoverable volume or whatever. And if you go over that, your arm's gonna fall off, your wife's gonna divorce you, and all these bad things. So I know it's kind of extreme, but some people view
Yeah,
it like
Yeah.
that. I used to
yeah,
view it like that when
yeah,
those originally came on. That was me, man. I was like
yeah,
afraid of this, but I also wanted to train with high volumes because that's what you have to do, right?
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I think that's probably been the one of the biggest shifts in my mind, and I imagine Zach shares this sentiment that like Zach's RIR meta-regression, this volume meta-regression, and then just when you think of really any body of research like supervised versus unsupervised training, for example, in a lot of ways, you can bet on harder training being more like uh more effective
More
training.
stimulative in
Yeah,
isolation. Yeah,
more
yeah,
stimulative. But like uh, like to your point, I I just finished a session right before we hopped on because I'm booked basically the rest of the night, and I had like 30 minutes to get it in. I cut my volume in half compared to what I normally do, and I'm not stressed about that because that's what I had time for, and I'm not gonna like stay up late. As a result of that, I probably prioritize getting a good night of sleep tonight over trying to double my volume, and I think that's gonna set me up to have a better session tomorrow. And like actually, as a result of this project, even though we didn't see a big increase in training frequency per muscle group, I've been training with more sessions per week, which isn't the same thing as like the frequency you're training each muscle, but I've just kind of been splitting my work up a little bit more throughout the week because I have more opportunities to have time and energy to put into training. So like some days I might train for 20, 30 minutes like today. But if I'm training 6 days a week, I live really close to the gym. If I have a day where I can train for 90 minutes, I'm going to take advantage of that. And I'm not stressed about like overdoing it or whatever, because again, in general, it seems like harder training is going to be more effective training. Now, that needs to be within reason because obviously if you just came off a 2 week vacation and then you go do a 20 set quad workout, yeah, that's not going to be a smart move. Um, and some people like I say that, but then I also have a handful of powerlifters that squat once a week because that's what they can tolerate and that's what they can sustain. And therefore, that's what's probably going to be best for them most of the time. Maybe we crank it up to, whoa, 2 times per week squatting when they're 8 weeks out from a meet. And it's just kind of moving the chess pieces around the chessboard based on a lot of practical things and just being mindful of like mood, being mindful of how it's affecting some of those other variables, ensuring that obviously intent to train is there. You're not sandbagging your RP as a result of very high fatigue, for example. And it's kind of simplified things a lot, man. Like that's really been the big one of the biggest changes for me over the last handful of years based on this project and others.
But I must say, Josh, please, I apologize. Please excuse me for cutting your gains in half by booking the live stream. I'm terribly sorry, man. It was
No,
not intentional, I swear.
no, you're good, man. I have a way of just like saying yes to enough things so that I just have a smaller and smaller window every day to train. And I'm not too worried about it because I'm actually increasing the efficiency of my training. I'm getting more out of each set.
Well, I hope that gets me to sleep tonight, man. And also just to be obviously respectful of for you guys' time, I wanted to ask you one last thing about with a with someone that wants to maximize hypertrophy, how can you actually measure that he's progressing in hypertrophy? Because it's not, let's say, strength, like, oh, his 1RM went up, easy. But with hypertrophy, well, gets a little bit more tricky. Do you guys agree with the I don't know if it's a model, would you call it a model? But the idea by Helms, which I actually apply in my own training and in with my clients, that we pay attention to the volume load increases, and if this particular individual is well rested, is eating well, everything seems to be in place, and he or she is progressing, we keep the volume the same. But if everything is in place, but he or she isn't progressing, maybe we can take into account adding one set or two sets. Do you guys agree with this particular way of doing things, or do you have any other things
I'll
to pay attention to?
I'll maybe give a slightly different answer. I'm not sure exactly what Josh's going to say, but I think the premise of your question makes sense, but I'm probably going to question the premise to some degree. So instead of saying, is monitoring your volume load when all the pieces are in place, and that was the phrasing that you used, I would say for me and just my coaching experience and kind of just my lifter brain speaking, I think the places are almost never in peace to make an informed decision on that personally. Um, Obviously, I think it quite literally is the best thing that we have, but more often than not, I think differences in the recovery time that you enter that session, the differences between your rest time between the previous exercise, the difference between your rest intervals within an exercise. Like there's just so many things that can kind of artificially change that ability and volume load that I view that as like a pretty loose indicator of progression, and I would probably look at it on a pretty darn long time scale
Hmm.
to the extent that I question how much of a decision criteria if that should really be. Like, obviously, if you're doing something and your volume load is blowing up because you're getting a ton stronger and you're adding a ton of reps, you just keep doing what you're doing awesome. Like that makes sense. But to some degree, in like the more average scenarios where things are pretty static, you might add a rep here, you might add a little bit of load there. I don't have a super satisfying answer of how I really handle it or how you really kind of know. I almost view it more from like a first principles perspective in terms of like, sure, we've taken care of executing training with an extreme high quality. You're basically trying to do as much of that as you can in a given window of time, as long as your performance isn't like regressing and you're showing signs of like very, very maladaptations. But I almost view the volume load as like a loose indicator rather than a primary indicator, if that makes sense, because I just think it's so, and this is something I've thought about recently is like, does it make sense to have quote unquote like test days like you would for a power lifter for a bodybuilder that essentially you're not trying to maximize strength per se. What you're trying to do is equalize the conditions in which you're testing something as much as humanly possible to have a valid comparison of something in terms of the volume load that you're accumulating within a given set exercise session, whatever it may be. So that's my kind of long answer to your question is like, yes, in theory, I think it would be like if we could hook up a sensor to look at the impulse on the fiber level for your muscle and what that's accumulating or what that's producing, I think that'd be the best way we could probably measure muscle size in the real world. And maybe that technology is coming, but given some of the constraints, like the thing that Josh just did today, for example, probably rushing a little bit to complete his exercises, probably rushing between exercises a little bit, maybe even switching up the protocols that he's using a little bit. That kind of uses that slot, and now that data is a little bit skewed to some degree, even if you're only using the first set or whatever. But then the next week, now he's performed less volume on this one session. So how does that impact on his performance in the next session in terms of the volume load that he's comparing it to? There's just so many things like that happen in practice that I view it more so as like, okay, let's review this past couple months of training. Am I generally progressing? Am I generally, feeling recovered and things like that? And you can use it as one of the criteria, but I don't think it's the criteria, if that makes sense personally.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Yeah, I second everything Zach said. Um, and I, again, I agree with Zach, but I just want to be clear of two things that Zach said, but I think it's just worth emphasizing because bas basically what it comes down to is measuring things is very hard, especially on the individual level, and especially with the tools that um, the average lifter will have access to. That's kind of the fundamental issue, right? I totally agree, but I think you 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 can accept that, and I think that can be comforting in a lot of ways to allow you to focus on the inputs of training. Okay, what are the relationships we generally see? we could debate all day long about whether there's actually a plateau past X sets of volume, but there's still some degree of a dose response relationship. There's some degree of a dose response relationship with RAR. Um, so we have some variables that seem to be the primary candidates that seem to drive a given adaptation. In this case, if we're talking about hypertrophy, focus on those, and then to ensure that things are moving in the right direction, use the tools you have, but don't overanalyze them and ensure that there's a long enough time scale. So I think well standardized progress photos has just become more and more important in my coaching practice for folks with hypertrophy and physique goals, which is something that I might have previously focused a little bit more on performance in the past. Um, but then on the performance front, I think that's a great tool. But if you're trying to overanalyze it block to block, week to week, that's where you're really going to just, I think, run into issues.
Yeah.
So you can use these tools as long as they're on a long enough time scale and those training inputs are in place. Good things are going to happen over a long enough time scale. I was going to say something else, but I lost my train of thought. Yeah, I think that's all I got.
Well, that's more than sufficient, man. And well, just to close up, I just want to thank you guys again. I think for me personally, this is such a privilege to get to talk to people like you that are actually doing the research. And you guys also, the way you communicate this research, your findings and your opinions, also your personal biases. I think it's something that not only of the results of your study, but how you communicate it, we can learn a lot to not get into set camp, high volume, low volume, whatever, but to look at it as tools, like you mentioned, like you alluded as tools that we can apply, but not go crazy about the use of set tools, right? So anyway, guys, I don't want to take any more of your times. With your permission, obviously, I'll be uploading the live stream as is. I promise I won't be editing anything with big volume sponsorships or anything like that to YouTube, so people can watch them with subtitles. So without much further to say, I just wanted to talk to you again. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and anytime you want to come to Mexico, you're more than welcome.
Hey, let's
Hey, appreciate
go.
it, man. Thanks for having us on.
My pleasure.